Thank you all for coming. As you know, I wrote a book called Nantucket Lights, which is the history of the lighthouses and the lightship. Lighthouses are romantic. People love them. But the compelling story, the story that legends are made of, is the lightship stories. And the lightships go back, the Greeks had them, the Romans had them, the British even had a lightship sitting at the mouth of the Thames. The first lightships came to be used in America in 1820. Nantucket got the first lightship in 1850. And it was a whaling community, and many of the men that were on these early lightships were sort of semi-retired whalers. They were usually older gentlemen who had been to sea. And they would go out on the Nantucket lightship for 4 months on, 2 months off. Those vessels really didn't move. They were anchored with a 7,000-pound anchor and a ton of chain, several tons of chain, that anchored it to the bottom of the ocean. So all their provisions and everything was brought from Nantucket out to them. And these fellows were doing something heroic. To me, the reason I love both lightships and lighthouses, these are people that were helping other people, and they had no concept of who they were helping. And it was just an act of caring. And even though they got paid for it, that was their living, many of the things they had to do were very, very dangerous. The Nantucket lightship is an icon. It's famous. People who were on bigger vessels, sailors, whatever, they came to know the Nantucket lightship, and it was positioned in harm's way. Unlike the average sailor, you don't want to be in harm's way, but you put the lightship where harm's way would be. This is the Nantucket 112, which is one of the last lightships. That's where it's stationed there at Grant Point. It was a beautiful sight to see. I think today they might have trouble getting it down the channel. Up until the early 1800s, the vessels were not that large. By the middle of the 1800s, the sea channel pretty much went from Boston to New York to Jamaica. The timber that built the majority of homes in America came out of the state of Maine. It came to Boston, and they had to go on the outside. In other words, they had to go outside of the Cape, and they had to go where the Nantucket shoals pretty much paralleled the sea channel. The danger became, as time went on, that the ships got larger and larger. And this little boat is sitting, this little vessel is sitting in the fog. It's 104 feet long. Fog distorts sound, so the rest, of course, is history. They were often hit. Nantucket is 200 miles due west of New York, which doesn't seem like it when you're driving up it, but that's the way it is. So this is actually taken in New Bedford or Fairhaven. So the first boat they took an old whaling ship and put some lights on it. Now all those lights had to be taken down, they had to be cleaned. They were using things like kerosene derivative. And if you didn't clean the light, obviously it wasn't visible. Hanging in the middle was a foghorn. This is one of the later, there it's more evident. They couldn't really put the lights any higher than 25 feet above the deck. because it would make the vessel top heavy. Here's a guy, he's up there, he's cleaning. Now, if you can picture the analogy, if any of you play tennis, picture a tennis ball bobbing in the water. And that's what life on the Lightship was like. It's like living on a tennis ball. And I've been on the Nantucket Lightship. If any of you get a chance, it's worth going on. Number one is there's no air. It's noisy. The early ones were moved by sail, but the later ones were diesel engines. And they generally had a crew of 10. So you picture a 104-foot vessel with 10 people on it. That's pretty crowded. This is the Olympic. That is the sister ship to the Titanic. And so as these vessels got bigger, they became the challenge. And eventually, that vessel collided with the Nantucket. In a sense, it created the death knell of the Lightship because the sick joke is that the captain of the Olympic, who was a fellow with a heavy German accent, said, yes, we hit her right on the U. In other words, the side of the boat spelled Nantucket, and they hit the letter U. About 6 men died. If you ever go to New Bedford, Mass., there is a monument to them. The White Star Line owned the Olympic. It led to the bankruptcy, actually, of the White Star Line. And they ended up giving about $500,000, which was huge money at that time, that compensated the men who died. And then they built that the 112, which is the earlier vessel I showed. This is the engine rooms here. And when I went on the Nantucket, that ship I went on, and the drone of the diesel engines would drive you crazy. I mean, it's just like a constant hum. When they're out on the shoals, the 2/3 of the year is fog. So 2/3 of the year, the horn blasts every few seconds. A friend of mine on island, Dick Mack, he's a docent at the Shipwreck Museum, and Dick served in the Coast Guard. And he said they learned to speak in cadence. So when the horn blew, they'd stop, and they got their few words in, and the horn blew again. And that would go on for 3 and 4 days at a time. I would think that few people could have endured that. So this is the building of the 112 when it was under construction. They tried to make this vessel safer. They had hatches, they had bells, they had everything, they had bells and whistles. But at the same time, the ships were getting larger. So it was a losing battle. This is, the mess room. It's tiny. You can see the Chesterfield and that's the bunks. And almost to the point where you have to be tied to the vessel. Now, at the turn of the century, a gentleman named Marconi, who you've all heard of, he was hired by the New York Herald Tribune to cover the America's Cup. And nobody had ever had any kind of communication. As luck would have it, there was no wind for about 4 days. So he was on some sort of a vessel, and he used some form of very primitive wireless to tell the New York Times no race was the headlines of the Herald Tribune. This went on, and it created a groundswell of enthusiasm. People were waiting for the race to come. Fast forward, he comes up to Nantucket, he goes to Sconset. When you go out Milestone Road, they just refurbished the house. As you get into the town on the right, there's a little house, it's that house. And he created, and for the covering of the America's Cup, he actually won the Nobel Prize for that. And so he came to Nantucket, and there's a big pole back there. Literally, they brought this thing in barges. They floated it from somewhere to here, carried it through town, and it was like 2 huge telephone poles on top of each other. And so he ended up having the first communication with the Nantucket Lightship. And then the idea of it was that he could radio to the Herald Tribune, and they could say, the Olympic will arrive in New York in 24 hours, because they had, of course, communicated with the vessel off Nantucket. They knew that by the next day it would be in New York. That sounds like nothing for us today, but that was landmark thing. David Sarnoff, ironically, who was the founder of RCA, actually was his assistant, and then left and went to New York, and that part is history. This is the job was boring. This is there's nothing to do there. One of these vessels actually stayed on site on the Nantucket shoals for 75 years. And it's amazing, but the way they built these were very full of ingenuity. That the boat that stayed for 75 years had a double hull, and supposedly they put salt between the hull, and that kept the wood from rotting. And how they do that, how they thought of it, I don't know, but there were a lot of geniuses on this island. That is a picture of what now sits at the shoals. It is a technological buoy that warns vessels of where they are. This led people to do something because life was boring, and it led to the beginning of the Lightship. The men on the ships chewed tobacco, and the tobacco came in wooden boxes. So the boxes became the base, and many of them had been coopers, which would be barrel makers when they were whalers. So if you look at the Nantucket Lightship basket, in a sense, it's got some feeling of a miniature barrel. Some of these sailors made as many as 200 baskets a year, and they would bring them back to Nantucket, and the ladies all ran the little shops up on Center Street, and they sold the baskets. Today, you and I go to Costco and we buy plastic buckets or whatever. The basket in that era was used for the yarn, it was used for potatoes, it was used for whatever you needed a place to put your stuff, because even refrigeration didn't exist. And so you can see, he's got $1.25 is the price on this one. Eventually, the basket became more glamorous. The Lightship with the lid was not done on the light ships. It was only the basic basket. This is a basket that we know was made on the sea. It says South Shore Shoal Lightship. Families went on to make more and more baskets. There is no future story for the Lightship. The last Lightship came off station in 1976, and there's a couple of Nantucket Lightships floating around. One's a hotel. They've been for a while. One of them was at the Intrepid, New York. It's very expensive to maintain and to keep. think in Norfolk, Virginia, there's one, but they took it out of the water and had it sitting on the ground. And, but the heroics that were there, the hardship that they endured for probably very, very little remuneration, because government jobs were desired, but they were never highly financially compensating to the people that did the job. So these people were very rugged. You and I don't think, could even begin to have endured the absolute quarters that they lived in. And the Nantucket 11, I think, broke its mooring at least 25 times. At one point, one of them breaking away ended up in Bermuda. So, and there is a story that says, they're not supposed to leave in the case of a hurricane. And in those days, there was no prediction of a hurricane. It wasn't like you turn your radio on when's a storm coming. And they were known or thought that they had broken the chain from the anchor for fear of their life. Those vessels were very scary. At one point in my life, I was in a monsoon storm in the Indian Ocean, where waves were 40 feet high, pounding over the vessel. We lost every life boat that was on the vessel. And that's kind of the way it is. One of the guys who was on the Lightship in later years, but he says it can be very dull. And he talks about the fog, how horrible that was. And then he says feeding the crew during heavy weather was a real problem for the cook, even with what they call fiddles. Fiddles is like a little ridge to hold the dishes on the table. The food would go flying all over the place. But he says, I'll never forget the first 3-day northeaster on Nantucket Station. I stayed awake the first couple of nights, thinking that if any problems developed, they would come at night. The flesh gets weak, so on the third night I turned in, leaving orders to call me when there was enough daylight to see. The watch called me. I started up the ladder to the bridge. I felt her dig into a big sea. If you've ever experienced that, it's quite something. After it passed, I went up and saw that she simply shook off the sea with no problem. I never stayed up another night because of sea conditions after that. That is not for the faint of heart. That is not for the wimps in the world. You have got to be a very, very strong character in terms of physicalness and in terms of mental capacity to stay there on those vessels. So I think that this is the most compelling story of maritime history of Nantucket, because it definitely took very, very special people to do and man these vessels. So anybody have any questions? I'm happy to answer. Yeah.
There is, I saw a Lightship in Boston Harbor
Right.
In June. Is that like privately owned? Do you know how it's being used?
I would say that they're all privately owned now. The government really doesn't take care of any, it's just like the lighthouses. They only take care of the lights of the lighthouses. The federal government has gotten out of the lighthouse and lightship business, so to speak. And because, with GPS and all the different things today, it just was expensive and was harming people's lives potentially to be on these vessels. So I would say it's private.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a couple of statistics questions. At any point in time, how many lightships would have been deployed around the Nantucket area, and generally where would they have been stationed? Part two of that number, what's the attrition statistic? How many were, any estimate, damaged in ice storms or collided with ships? Any idea of how many of just met the demise by
Well, they all were badly damaged. You know, even the 112 went through, I forget whether it was Hurricane Donna, but, and part of the area where the captain would stand, that whole window area was supposedly pushed in. I think they all needed repair all the time. There was, the Nantucket Lightship moved around. In the early days, it was 14 miles off the island.
One ship?
Right, the Lightship, sorry.
There's only one.
Well, it's various vessels. The government changed the names and numbers on these things all the time. So if you want to get really, you know, people will talk about number 11, they'll talk about number 1, number 66, they have all these names, and then sometimes the government used the term relief, and they would put relief on the side. They would put that vessel on Nantucket station and take the other vessel off for repairs. There was the Cross Rip Lightship. There was the famous Ambrose Lightship, which is coming into New York, which many people, especially after World War II and all, that was like looking at the Statue of Liberty in its own little way. And so to answer your question, they really had them all over. They were even in the Great Lakes. They were even in the West Coast. Along, there is a very wonderful museum on the Columbia River in Oregon. I really recommend if you're ever out there, because there were a lot of shipwrecks. They went where there was danger, where they could not put a lighthouse. That was the basis of it. And so I'm sort of being a little vague, but there were you know, 2 or 3 different lightships that were at different stations around here. Some at the same time, some not, you know, at different periods. And the government got up on a Monday morning and said, we're moving this one, and they did. You know, that was, they evidently knew what they were doing. And shipping was changing, so that made it, that's why it went from 14 miles off Nantucket to 42 miles at the end of its life, because the size of the vessels were such that they couldn't come any closer to Nantucket than that. Yeah.
Now, did I read that you wrote your book while staying on a lightship?
No.
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 Did you
I
think that
I
too?
get seasick in a 1-foot shop. I would not. I would definitely not. No, but I interviewed quite a few people up in Brunswick, Maine. There's another museum. There's a lot of really wonderful small museums like this all over America. And the fellow up there, his last name was Black, he'd been on the Lightship. It almost becomes like a fraternity among these guys. And the museum director in Portland, Oregon, that's really why I went out there, because he had been on the Lightship. You know. But I've been on it when it's been brought here. And Andrea, you know, it goes to Martha's Vineyard now, pretty much, too. The one that's the hotel.
Yes, there's one
Yeah.
that's stationed there.
But no, I've set foot on it, but I've never slept or stayed on it. Yeah. So, any other questions? Well, anyway,
Yeah.
more details are here, and yeah.
Did you say that the lighthouses are privately owned?
Yes, well, either by
FEMA grant?
trust, well, America ran into the conflict of the cost of keeping all the lighthouses, and the lighthouse service and the lightship service, they all eventually became the Coast Guard. That's simplification, but in general, that's what it amounted to. So the Coast Guard was always in need of cutting budgets, one thing or led to another. So they set out to do a program where they pretty much sold the lighthouses or gave them to trusts. For example, Sankaty is part of the Sconset Trust, and they man the light. The same with Great Point, which needs some help right now. Somebody needs to do something to paint it and clean it up. But So it's a marginal thing that we've got going on with our lighthouses, and it's better in private hands because those people, do it out of love. Yeah.
And we just visited the Nazca Lighthouse in Falmouth, and they're restoring it.
Okay.
And it's a 501c.
Okay.
Friends of Nazca, they're doing it.
Right.
And it's
Now, the
quite
Nazca,
impressive.
though, the steamship, the ferry.
The Nazca Lighthouse
Oh, the Nazca Lighthouse.
in
Okay.
Falmouth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I
you
mean,
can
there's a
go-
lot of people that take a lot of care, There's a wonderful trip that's the trustees of the reservation. They are a not-for-profit in Massachusetts. They own a good portion of O2, which goes out to Great Point, and you can go out in a van with them and actually, if the polvers are not there, you can climb the lighthouse. But they have access to it, but they don't really own it, but the government runs it.
Karen, I was late. Did you mention the moving of the Sankaty?
I didn't get into that.
Oh, okay. It's just-
But I will touch on that. I live near there, and I joke, it's a sick joke, in 25 years I'm going to have a waterfront house because the erosion is substantial. They are working diligently, pouring truckloads of dirt and trying to create something like the pyramids against the bluff, but it's not helping. Sankaty was a long way from the coast, if you look at older pictures in here even, and eventually it became evident that it wasn't going to last too long. So they spent about 2 months moving it. I actually came up here to photograph it, and they put it on something that I'll describe like railroad tracks. And that lighthouse was built in 1850. It's original, and so anything that would be a bad move could have destroyed it. So they slowly inched this thing, and they actually had to go slightly downhill, and then they had to sort of set it down onto a whole new foundation. So, it's still not that far away from the cliff, but that was a major thing, and that was with private funds that worked to preserve the lighthouse. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much, all of you.